Stone older than memory stands cut from living rock, a lion's body fused to a human gaze, fixed on the horizon where the sun claws its way up each day. Wind strips the surface grain by grain, sand rises and buries, water once ran where desert now rules, and still the figure remains, half geology, half intention. Records name kings, temples, and victories, yet this shape waits at the edge of what was written, present in silence, altered by hands that repaired more often than they explained. Quarry scars, tool lines, runoff channels, and buried floors overlap like fingerprints pressed over centuries, each layer real, none complete. The question is not just who carved it, but when stone, climate, and belief first locked together in this form. Before we dive deeper, ignite that like button and prepare for the revelations to come. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, what time it is there. And as always with our videos, the visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Thank you for always having our back. Prepare yourself, and let's dive in. Morning light hits the plateau at a low angle, pulling long shadows out of every cut in the limestone, and the monument's surface stops looking smooth and starts looking like terrain. Ridges, hollows, vertical seams, soft bulges where stone has retreated. Details that vanish at noon, suddenly read like a map of stress and exposure. The body is not assembled block by block like a pyramid. It is continuous with the ground, a mass left behind when the surrounding rock was quarried away. That difference matters immediately. Built masonry behaves like stacked books, each layer separate. Bedrock carving behaves like a cliff face, every crack tied to deeper layers beneath. What stands here is closer to landscape shaped into meaning than statue placed on a platform. The enclosure around the figure drops below the surrounding plateau, forming a shallow bowl. Anything that moves across the surface, sand in dry years, water in wet ones, naturally drifts downward into this space. Limestone, the stone underfoot, began as marine sediment, mud and shells compressed on an ancient seabed. When such rock is exposed to air, its weaker layers erode faster, leaving harder bands protruding. That is why the walls of the enclosure look ribbed rather than flat. Some layers crumble into powder with a fingernail scrape, others resist a hammer. The sculptors did not choose this variability. They inherited it. Carving here meant negotiating geology, not imposing perfect symmetry. Look closely along the torso and the rear flanks, and the surface undulates in broad, rounded sweeps. These are not sharp chisel facets, but smoothed recesses that run vertically, following the direction water would take as it trickles down a face. Wind-driven sand usually cuts edges into angles, like a sand blaster etching glass, but repeated runoff rounds instead of facets. The difference is subtle until compared side by side with nearby pyramid blocks. Those blocks show crisp corner loss and pitting, typical of desert abrasion. The body in the enclosure reads softer, as if long-term moisture once played a larger role. This does not give a date by itself. It describes a process, like seeing tree rings without knowing the year. The head rises from a harder layer, which is why facial contours survive better than the chest and back. Stone density varies like bread baked unevenly, some parts crust, others crumb. Tool marks on the head are tighter and more regular because dense limestone allows finer cuts without tearing. On the body, broader strokes dominate, partly from softer stone and partly from scale. Carving a face 6 meters high demands different gestures than carving a palm-sized figurine. The transition between head and body is therefore not just artistic, but geological. A seam where nature's layering meets human intention. Around the monument lie blocks cut from the same bedrock, dragged a short distance and set into temples. You can match their texture and fossil speckles, like matching pieces of the same loaf. This shows that the excavation of the enclosure produced building material used nearby. Sequence becomes a puzzle of before and after. Stone must be removed before it can be built elsewhere, yet cutting deeper exposes softer layers that then erode faster. Time and construction intertwine. Later builders also reused earlier cuts, trimming edges, squaring corners, fitting their plans into an inherited scar on the plateau. The landscape is cumulative, like a palimpsest, a manuscript scraped and written over, where earlier words still ghost beneath later ink. Ancient repairs cling to the lower body, blocks wedged against eroding surfaces, patches where original contours vanished. Each repair is a time-stamp of concern, evidence that later generations saw damage worth slowing. The materials differ slightly, color, grain, joint style, allowing phases to be separated the way a mason reads mortar lines. None of these patches explain the first carving. They document ongoing maintenance, a dialogue between decay and intervention. Burial under sand acted at times like a blanket, reducing temperature swings and shielding from wind. Exposure did the opposite, accelerating stress. The monument's history is therefore not a straight line of aging, but cycles of concealment and revelation. Orientation adds another layer. The face looks east, towards the horizon where the sun appears, a daily rebirth that ancient Egyptian religion linked to renewal and kingship. The alignment is close, not mathematically perfect, which fits a culture that worked with sightlines and ritual axes rather than laser precision. The figure occupies a threshold between river plain and high plateau, a liminal zone, meaning a boundary space, where processions once moved from water to tomb. Placement here ties stone, ceremony, and terrain together without a single inscription spelling it out. Measurements taken over the last century show slow change, millimeters lost from a curve, a crack lengthened, a patch replaced. Laser scans now freeze the surface in digital form, millions of points describing every contour. These data are like medical records, tracking condition rather than origin. They show that the monument is not frozen in the past, but active in the present, stone still responding to moisture, salt, heat. Interpretation must therefore separate what belongs to the first shaping from what belongs to thousands of years of exposure and care. What emerges from the surface itself is a record written in erosion, repair, and adaptation. It does not speak in royal names or dates, but in textures and transitions, in how rock yields and how people respond. The figure is at once sculpture and outcrop, a decision carved into geology and then carried forward by environment and memory. Any search for beginnings must pass through this physical evidence first, because before stories, before attributions, there is stone behaving according to its nature, modified but never fully silenced by the hands that shaped it. Footprints once cut a temporary road across the plateau each season, pressed into dust that erased itself by the next wind. The construction zone was not silent or ceremonial at first. It sounded like quarry work, hammerstone against chisel, sled runners scraping, shouted counts keeping rhythm as blocks slid over wet clay, limestone fractures along natural plains, and workers learned to read those lines the way a carpenter reads wood grain. Strike wrong, and the stone shatters. Strike along the bedding, and it parts in sheets. This practical knowledge shaped the ground long before the monument's final form emerged, turning the plateau into a layered archive of cuts, ramps, and discarded fragments. Quarry faces near the enclosure show extraction patterns that look like stair steps frozen in rock. Blocks were pried free in sequences, leaving negative spaces later adapted into foundations, walls, or left as voids. Some of the stone removed here appears in nearby temples where matching fossil inclusions, tiny shell spirals and broken coral shapes, tie source to destination. Such lithological matching, meaning identification by stone type and internal features, works like a fingerprint. It establishes connection without a written label. The act of carving the enclosure therefore doubled as supply, a pragmatic loop where shaping the landscape yielded building material. Administrative control is visible indirectly. Seal impressions and ostraca, pottery sherds used like notepads, found in workers' areas elsewhere on the plateau show rationing systems and crew names. Bread, beer, onions, and dried fish formed predictable distributions, suggesting organized labor rather than ad hoc effort. Teams had identities, often tied to the king, like sports clubs named for a patron. This social structure matters because large bedrock carving requires sustained coordination, not a weekend of hauling. Yet such records focus on logistics, not sculpture. They tell us how people were fed and counted, not which rock face they shaped. The landscape itself guided decisions. The plateau slopes gently east, and ancient Nile channels lay closer than today. Water transport brought granite from Aswan and basalt from the Fayum, heavy stones set in temples near the enclosure. These materials contrast sharply with local limestone, dark against pale, hard against soft. Their presence marks spaces of ritual intensity. The temple east of the monument uses massive limestone blocks fitted without decoration, emphasizing mass and shadow over relief carving. Its austerity feels deliberate, like a stage set where light performs. Stone from the enclosure likely entered this structure, linking void and building in a single operational sequence. Tool marks vary across surfaces. Some cuts show broad, shallow scallops from copper chisels hardened with arsenic, a common alloy in the Old Kingdom. Others show pecking from dolerite pounders, fist-sized stones used to rough out surfaces. The combination suggests stages, pounding to remove bulk, chiseling to refine. Where rock quality shifted, technique adapted. Softer layers required less force, but more caution to avoid overcutting. Harder bands demanded patience. These traces are the handwriting of labor, preserved where erosion has not erased them. Spatial relationships complicate chronology. Mastaba tombs, rectangular stone superstructures over burial shafts, cluster north of the enclosure, their orientations respecting earlier cuts. When a tomb edge aligns neatly with an existing quarry face, it implies the face was already there. Stratigraphy, the study of layered deposits, applies to architecture as well as soil. One feature overlays another in time, even without dates. The causeway linking Valley Temple to Pyramid runs nearby, its path constrained by terrain already modified. Planning here looks adaptive, not tabula rasa, a Latin phrase meaning blank slate. builders worked with what existed, integrating old scars into new geometry. Silence in inscriptions from this period is not unusual for landscape features. Roads, canals, and quarries rarely receive dedicatory texts. Their importance is functional, assumed rather than proclaimed. If a colossal guardian form emerged from such a quarry context, it might initially have been understood as part of the terrain's transformation, rather than a standalone cult statue demanding a name. Meaning can accumulate later. The way a crossroads becomes sacred after repeated stories attach to it. Climate frames the background. During the early dynastic and Old Kingdom periods, conditions were already trending drier than earlier millennia, yet seasonal rains still occurred. Even infrequent storms can carve channels if repeated over centuries. The enclosure's bowl shape would concentrate runoff, accelerating vertical streaking on walls and flanks. Salt drawn upward by groundwater, then crystallizing as moisture evaporates, pries grains apart from within. This haloclasty, salt-driven weathering, acts invisibly until flakes detach. Such processes operate regardless of human intention, adding a natural script over carved surfaces. Transport technology also leaves clues. Sledges dragged over prepared tracks reduce friction when water or oil is applied, a technique shown in tomb scenes where a figure pours liquid ahead of a statue being hauled. The plateau's leveled strips could have served as such routes. Ramps of compacted debris once rose and fell, now gone but hinted at by gradients and leftover fill. Movement here was engineered as carefully as carving because distance multiplies weight. Over time, the area shifted from active construction to memorial landscape. Once primary buildings slowed, sand began to reclaim low spots. Without crews to clear drift, the enclosure filled gradually, preserving some surfaces under cover while exposing others to full stress. Later visitors encountered a different monument than the builders did. Head above dunes, body hidden, meaning reframed. The same stone hosted multiple chapters without rewriting its first lines. Across this terrain, evidence lies in relationships rather than declarations. Stone removed becomes stone set. Cuts guide later walls. Tool traces change with geology. Logistics imply capacity. Climate edits surfaces slowly. Each element alone is partial. Together they outline a working environment capable of large-scale bedrock shaping embedded within broader royal construction. The monument stands as the most visible remnant of that environment, but the surrounding scars and structures are its context, the negative space that explains how such a form could emerge from a quarry and persist as both landscape and image. Names travel differently than stone. A block can be cut, moved, and fitted in a single season, but a name depends on someone choosing to record it, someone else preserving it, and time not erasing the surface that carried it. Across the plateau, royal names appear on statues, relief fragments, and seal impressions, yet large features of terrain often pass without labels. Text favors what participates in ritual exchange, offerings, gods, kingship titles, more than what simply exists as shaped ground. This bias matters when searching for origins, because absence in writing may reflect category rather than chronology. Old Kingdom inscriptions are formal and formulaic. They list the king's Horus name, throne name, and epithets linking him to cosmic order, a principle called ma'at, meaning balance and rightness that keeps the world from sliding into chaos. Such texts accompany temples and statues placed within cult spaces where priests recited daily rites. A monument carved directly from bedrock at the edge of a processional route may not have entered that inventory in the same way. If its role was protective or symbolic rather than the focal point of offerings, scribes might not have treated it as a discrete object requiring dedication text. When writing does mention large figures, it often does so indirectly. A statue can be called the image of the king without describing pose or scale. Temple inventories note materials, gold, diorite, cedar, because value and ritual purity mattered. Form was assumed from context. This habit complicates identification. Even if a colossal lion-bodied form stood nearby, a text might refer only to the great image without further detail. Surviving fragments from the Fourth Dynasty concentrate on tomb biographies and administrative notes. Officials boast of quarrying expeditions, canal digging, and organizing labor, practical achievements that supported royal projects. The tone is logistical pride, not architectural catalog. Later periods provide clearer titles, but for a monument already ancient by then. In the New Kingdom, inscriptions call the figure Hor-em-akhet, Horus in the horizon, merging a falcon sky god with the place where sun rises. The horizon in Egyptian thought is not just a line, but a zone of transformation, like a doorway where day is born. Such naming reframes the monument as a divine presence rather than a royal portrait. The famous Dream Stela between the paws tells of a prince sleeping in the statue's shade and hearing a promise of kingship if sand is cleared away. The narrative emphasizes restoration, not construction, presenting the king as caretaker of something venerable. This shift illustrates how monuments accumulate identity. A structure can begin as part of a building program and later function as a god's body, the way a palace room becomes a chapel over centuries. Text follows function. When priests composed hymns or stelae, they addressed the being they believed stood before them, not the workshop event that shaped the stone. The earlier phase fades because it no longer serves the ritual present. Such theological layering is common in Egypt, where deities merge, split, and acquire epithets reflecting local traditions. Greek visitors, writing centuries later, add another perspective. Their accounts describe size and damage but rarely give Egyptian names accurately. They report what they see, filtered through their own categories of wonder. The lion body with human head becomes a marvel, not an entry in a royal ledger. Absence of a builder's name in these sources is expected. Foreign travelers did not access temple archives, and many archives were already lost. Language itself can erase. Egyptian hieroglyphs carved in shallow relief weather faster than deep-cut architecture. Papyrus rots unless sealed in desert dryness. Reused blocks get flipped, faces recut, texts buried in foundations. The survival of any inscription is partly accident. Therefore, historians distinguish between evidence of absence and absence of evidence. The first would be a text explicitly stating something was not done. The second is simply silence. The record here is largely the latter. Epigraphic surveys catalog graffiti around the plateau, small carvings by visitors across eras. These include prayers, names, and dates, showing continued engagement. None from the Old Kingdom explicitly mention the monument's carving. Quarry marks, however, do appear on blocks taken from the enclosure and set into temples. These marks record work gangs and orientation arrows, practical notes like chalk lines on timber. They show activity, but not narrative intent. A crew label can tell us who moved stone, not why a figure was shaped. Genre shapes memory. Religious texts focus on afterlife journeys, stars, and gods. Administrative records track grain, labor, and taxes. Royal inscriptions celebrate victories and temple endowments. A bedrock carving at a necropolis edge straddles categories without fitting neatly into one. It is not a portable statue, not a temple wall, not a tomb interior. Such liminal objects risk slipping through the textual net. Over time, later names overwrite earlier identities. Medieval Arabic writers call the statue Abu al-Hol, Father of Dread, reflecting emotional impact rather than origin. Each culture renames according to its frame, like a mountain known by different words in neighboring valleys. None of these names preserve the first chisel strike. They document reception, not inception. The textual landscape therefore runs parallel to the stone landscape. It records how people addressed, repaired, and revered the monument across centuries. It does not narrate the initial carving in surviving lines. This gap does not resolve the question of origin, but it sets boundaries on what texts can answer. Where writing ends, other evidence, tool marks, quarry relationships, erosion patterns, must carry more weight. The monument stands partly inside history's speech, and partly in its quiet margins, where meaning existed without being spelled out, and where survival depended as much on category and chance as on the intention to remember. Sand does not arrive as a single dramatic wave. It comes grain by grain, lifted, carried, and set down in patterns shaped by wind and obstacle. The enclosure around the monument acts like a bowl placed in a moving stream of air. Once construction crews withdrew and regular clearing stopped, drift began to accumulate along the flanks, first in thin sheets, then in slopes that pressed against stone. Burial is often imagined as destruction, yet for carved limestone it can function as insulation. Covered surfaces avoid direct wind abrasion and rapid temperature swings. Hidden areas age differently from exposed ones, creating a patchwork of preservation across the same body. Ancient people noticed this cycle. In the New Kingdom, rulers ordered clearance, not because sand had suddenly appeared, but because it had slowly reclaimed a space that required labor to maintain. Clearing reveals, and revelation changes stress. When packed sediment is removed, previously supported stone faces meet open air again. Moisture trapped behind repair blocks evaporates differently, salts migrate, and cracks widen. Each excavation, ancient or modern, resets conditions. The monument's history therefore includes environmental states as distinct as architectural phases. The enclosure floor preserves traces of repeated infill. Layers of compacted sand and silt alternate with surfaces trampled hard or paved. Such layering is stratigraphy in action, the same principle used to read tells, artificial mounds built from centuries of occupation. Except here, the layers are mostly natural deposits punctuated by human intervention. Some strata contain pottery shards or small objects dropped by visitors, allowing relative dating of exposure episodes. Others are sterile, suggesting intervals when no one walked there because the body lay hidden. Water, though scarce today, participates quietly. When rain falls on limestone, it dissolves minute amounts of calcium carbonate, the stone's main component. Over long periods, this chemical weathering rounds edges and deepens channels where flow repeats. The enclosure's geometry funnels runoff from higher ground. Even modest storms, spaced across centuries, can etch persistent paths. Groundwater adds another route. Capillary action draws moisture upward through pores. As it evaporates near the surface, salts crystallize, prying grains apart. This haloclasty, or salt weathering, leaves flaking skins and granular loss along lower courses. Temperature swings matter too. Desert days heat stone, nights cool it. Expansion and contraction occur at different rates in different layers, especially where ancient repairs introduce stones with slightly different properties. Microcracks form, linking into networks that guide later erosion. Burial dampens these swings. Exposure amplifies them. Thus, a decision to clear sand is also a decision to alter thermal stress. Historical accounts describe the monument in varying states. Some travelers saw only the head, others chest and paws. Drawings from early modern visitors show dunes rising like frozen waves around the neck. These images are not precise surveys, but they record presence and absence over time. When 19th century excavators cleared large volumes of sand, they exposed surfaces that had not seen open air for generations. Photographs from that era show deeper recesses along the body than are visible today, before some were infilled during conservation. Repair campaigns mark moments of response. Masonry buttresses at the paws and chest date stylistically to the New Kingdom and later periods. Romans added blocks in practical fashion, aiming to stabilize rather than restore ideal form. Modern efforts in the 20th century used cement at first, then retreated from it when trapped moisture accelerated decay. Each intervention leaves a signature, visible in joint patterns and stone color. Conservation is therefore part of the monument's material story, not a neutral act outside history. Burial also shapes meaning. A figure half hidden becomes enigmatic, its scale inferred rather than seen. The head alone suggests a watchful presence emerging from earth, encouraging myth. Full exposure reveals the body's mass and the enclosure's geometry, shifting interpretation toward engineering and geology. Perception tracks visibility. When sand concealed the flanks, observers focused on the face. When cleared, attention moved to erosion and structure. Wind patterns themselves have changed subtly with regional climate shifts and human alteration of land use. Irrigation, agriculture, and urban growth modify local humidity and dust sources. Modern pollution introduces acids that can react with limestone surfaces. Monitoring stations now track such variables, recognizing that present conditions differ from ancient ones. The monument continues to respond, making its future as dynamic as its past. The cycle of burial and exposure complicates attempts to read a single, continuous weathering history. Some surfaces record long exposure, others were shielded for centuries. This mosaic resists simple timelines. Instead, it asks for phased understanding, like a patient chart listing different treatments and environments over a lifetime. The stone's condition at any moment is a sum of these phases, not a direct line back to first carving. Across millennia, people have engaged in a repeated choreography. Sand advances, humans retreat. Humans advance, sand retreats. Between these moves, water, salt, and temperature write their own scripts. The monument endures not as an untouched relic, but as a participant in environmental exchange. Its present form is a snapshot in that ongoing dance, shaped by concealment as much as by chisels, and by the decision, again and again, to uncover what the desert would quietly keep. Measurements begin with simple questions: how long, how high, how wide, but they quickly expose complexity. The monument stretches roughly 73 meters from the tips of the paws to the end of the tail, a span longer than a modern passenger jet. Height from the enclosure floor to the crown of the head approaches 20 meters, the vertical reach of a 6-story building. These numbers establish scale, yet scale alone does not reveal intention. What matters is how those dimensions relate to each other and to the stone that made them possible. The body appears elongated compared with later Sphinx statues, where heads dominate proportionally. Here, the torso is massive, and the head comparatively small, an imbalance that has prompted repeated comment. One explanation lies in geology rather than design. The harder limestone layer suitable for fine carving sits at the level of the head. Below it, softer layers dictated how much material could be safely left projecting without collapse. Carvers may have preserved more mass in the body to maintain structural stability, like leaving thick piers when cutting rooms from a cliff. Surveyors over the last century have mapped the surface with increasing precision. Early explorers used chains and sighting rods, working around sand and debris. 20th century teams employed theodolites, optical instruments for measuring angles, to establish reference grids. In the 21st century, laser scanners captured millions of points across the surface, producing digital models accurate to millimeters. Each method reflects its era's technology, yet all converge on the same basic geometry. A figure integrated with its enclosure, not freestanding, but continuous with bedrock. Proportional analysis compares parts to wholes: the head's width across the cheeks, the distance between eyes, the length from chin to brow. These ratios can be expressed in modern units or in ancient cubits. The Egyptian measure roughly the length of a forearm. Some dimensions approximate whole cubits, others do not. This irregularity suggests adaptation rather than strict modular planning. Bedrock carving imposes constraints that block construction does not. A mason stacking blocks can adjust thickness course by course. A carver in living rock negotiates flaws and hardness shifts, encountered only as the surface recedes. Orientation adds another measurable layer. The axis of the body points close to east, the direction of sunrise at the equinox, though not perfectly aligned. Deviations of fractions of a degree are typical in ancient architecture, reflecting observational methods based on horizon sightings rather than instruments. The slight offset is recorded, not interpreted in isolation. Nearby temples and causeways share similar tolerances, forming a network of broadly consistent axes rather than a single exact line. Surface geometry reveals more subtle data. Contour maps show gentle curvature along the back and flanks, following bedding planes in the limestone. There are no sharp transitions where a sculptor forced an angle. Instead, slopes change gradually, as if design flowed with natural layers. Asymmetries are present. One side of the face sits marginally higher, one flank shows deeper recession. These are not errors so much as outcomes of differential weathering and subsidence, small ground movements documented in geological surveys. Tool marks, where preserved, provide micro-measurements. Width of chisel strokes correlates with stone hardness, broader in softer zones, finer in dense layers. Depth of pecking pits from dolerite pounders varies according to stage of roughing. Such data help reconstruct working sequence without naming the workers. They are procedural footprints, showing how mass became form. Comparative measurement extends beyond the monument. Statues from temples at Giza, Saqqara, and beyond have been scanned and measured, creating databases of royal portrait proportions. When the head is compared statistically with these samples, it falls within a broad Old Kingdom range, but does not match any single statue exactly. Variation is normal. Royal imagery emphasized timeless kingship more than individual likeness. Measurement, therefore, supports association with a sculptural tradition without pinpointing identity. Temporal measurement, tracking change over time, adds another dimension. Repeated surveys reveal millimeters of loss in exposed areas, accumulation of salts, widening of fissures. Engineers treat the monument as a system under load, subject to stress analysis. Repairs alter mass distribution, influencing how cracks propagate. Numbers here serve conservation, not attribution. Yet they underscore that the form seen today differs subtly from that of a century ago. Even the enclosure contributes measurable context. Wall heights vary several meters due to natural slope and erosion. Floor gradients guide water eastward. Distances between the monument, adjacent temple, and causeway have been tabulated, showing spatial relationships that tie features into a coherent landscape plan. These figures anchor interpretation in physical fact, reducing reliance on impression. Measurement, however, maintains a boundary. It describes what is, not why it is so. Ratios, angles, and volumes form a baseline, a neutral language of quantity. Meaning enters only when these numbers are set alongside other evidence, geology, texts, and cultural practice. The technical record deliberately separates data from narrative, ensuring that interpretation does not outrun observation. What emerges is a portrait in numbers. A mass carved from layered rock, aligned with the rising sun, proportioned by both intention and constraint, and slowly shifting under environmental forces. Precision increases with each generation of tools, yet the essential geometry remains constant. Measurement frames the monument as a physical reality first, a story second. In that order lies its discipline: to see stone as it stands, mapped and quantified, before seeking the names and purposes that history may or may not provide. Faces invite recognition even when time has stripped them of detail. The monument's head, carved from denser limestone than the body, holds contours that read as human despite missing elements. The nose is gone, the ceremonial beard broken, the cobra emblem that once rose from the brow lost. What remains is structure: cheek planes, eye sockets, the framing lines of a striped headdress known as the nemes, a cloth crown worn by Egyptian kings. This headdress wraps the skull and falls in lappets along the cheeks, a visual signal of royalty more than fashion. Comparing this face with other royal images requires caution. Egyptian sculpture favored idealization, a style that emphasizes eternal kingship rather than personal portrait. Think of a corporate logo versus a photograph. One stands for an office, the other for a person. Statues of different rulers often share similar proportions, while statues of the same ruler can vary across materials and workshops. Measurement can identify ranges and clusters, not fingerprints. Early comparisons relied on drawings and plaster casts, methods vulnerable to lighting and perspective. Modern approaches use photogrammetry, building 3D models from overlapping photographs, and laser scanning. These techniques capture curvature and depth with high resolution. When the head is digitized and compared to scanned statues from nearby temples, similarities appear in general facial outline and headdress form. Differences persist in jaw breadth and facial elongation. Such overlap fits a shared artistic tradition rather than a single template. Damage complicates matters. Weathering softens eyelids and lips. Repairs introduce new stone along edges. 19th and 20th century interventions patched the chin and jaw, subtly altering contours. Distinguishing original carving from later masonry requires close inspection of joint lines and stone texture. Even then, erosion may have erased tool marks that once defined transitions. The face seen today is a composite, like a manuscript with missing lines and later annotations. Scale exerts its own influence. Carving a head 6 meters high demands decisions different from those for a handheld statue. Small asymmetries, invisible at close range, read as natural from a distance. The eyes are deeply set, creating shadow that animates the gaze at sunrise and sunset. The mouth, though worn, suggests a slight curvature often called the archaic smile in Greek art, but in Egypt it reflects convention rather than emotion. Such features belong to a visual language of authority. The Nem's headdress provides structural clues. Its pleats are simplified compared with finely carved diorite statues, likely because limestone at this scale resists crisp detailing without risk of fracture. The lappets follow the rock's contours, indicating adaptation to geology. Behind the headdress merges into the back, reinforcing the sense that the form grows from stone rather than sitting atop it. Fragments of the beard found in earlier excavations show a braided false beard of a type used in royal iconography. False beards symbolize divine status, not daily wear, similar to a crown worn for ceremony. Whether the beard belonged to the original phase or a later restoration remains debated, as beards were added to statues in different periods. Its presence nonetheless confirms the intended royal divine identity. Photographic records across decades reveal shifting surface conditions. Early images show deeper fissures along the cheeks. Later conservation filled some recesses. One eye appears slightly higher than the other, an asymmetry documented before modern repairs. Geological settling and differential erosion can tilt features subtly over millennia. Precision in comparison must therefore include uncertainty margins, acknowledging that millimeters matter when scaling across meters. Beyond facial features, the head's relationship to the body matters. The neck is thick, a structural necessity when carving from layered rock. A slender neck would risk breakage along bedding planes. The head's relative smallness compared with the torso may reflect this engineering logic. Stability takes precedence over ideal proportion when the statue cannot be separated from its base. Iconographic elements, those tied to meaning, frame interpretation. The cobra, or uraeus, once affixed to the brow, represents protective power, a rearing serpent that spits fire at enemies in myth. Its loss removes a clear royal marker, but the base where it sat remains visible. Combined with the nemes, the uraeus would have made the identity unmistakable to ancient viewers. Digital overlays attempt to align the head with statues attributed to specific kings, scaling and rotating models to compare planes. Results show partial fits and mismatches, depending on chosen landmarks. Scholars emphasize that such exercises illustrate degrees of similarity, not proof. Erosion, repair, and original variation blur boundaries. The face thus operates at the edge of recognition. It signals kingship through headdress and scale, yet withholds personal identity. Its survival owes as much to geology as to artistry. It stands as a mask worn by the plateau, a humanized summit emerging from layered stone. Comparisons can situate it within a tradition, but the tradition itself allowed breadth. In this sense, the head confirms cultural context without resolving authorship. It is evidence of intention shaped by convention, material constraint, and centuries of alteration, a portrait of a role rather than a named individual. Placement can speak as clearly as inscription when a monument is embedded in a designed landscape. The figure lies at a hinge point between river plain and high plateau, where processional routes once climbed from the Nile's edge toward the pyramids. To the east stands a temple built of massive limestone blocks, fitted with precision but left undecorated in its earliest phase. Its plan consists of courts and corridors arranged along the same general east-west axis as the monument. This spatial echo suggests coordination, yet coordination does not demand simultaneous carving. Later builders often align with what already dominates a site. The enclosure surrounding the figure follows natural bedding lines rather than geometric symmetry. The western wall rises higher because the plateau slopes upward there. The eastern side drops toward lower ground. Such irregularity shows that carvers responded to rock conditions. When temples rose nearby, architects integrated these contours into their layouts. The temple east of the monument uses stone matching the enclosure's geology, linking excavation and construction in a material loop. Blocks that once formed the sides of the pit became walls and pillars, turning absence into presence. A causeway connects the valley temple near the ancient river channel to a pyramid complex upslope. This paved route cuts diagonally across the terrain, passing near the enclosure's northern edge. Processions moving along it would encounter the figure in profile, then head-on as they turned. Movement through space shapes perception. A monument encountered after a climb from water to desert acquires symbolic charge as a threshold marker, a guardian between worlds. In Egyptian belief, boundaries held power. Doorways, horizons, and riverbanks were sites of transformation. Distances between features have been carefully measured. The figure sits roughly midway between Valley Temple and Pyramid, along the causeway's projected path. This mid-position is not exact, but approximate alignment suffices for ritual geography. Ancient planners favored sightlines and experiential sequencing over grid perfection. From certain vantage points, the monument's head aligns with pyramid edges, creating layered silhouettes at sunrise. Such visual relationships arise from topography as much as intention, yet once noticed, they can be incorporated into meaning. North of the enclosure lie mastaba tombs belonging to officials. Their placement respects earlier quarry cuts, indicating the enclosure predated them. Tomb builders fit their monuments into remaining spaces, weaving private commemoration into royal terrain. Southward, the bedrock shows further quarry scars, stepped faces where stone was extracted. The pattern suggests an organized quarry field rather than random pits. The figure emerges from the largest remaining mass within this field, a sculptural decision embedded in industrial context. The enclosure floor slopes gently east, matching drainage lines that carry runoff towards the valley. This gradient would have influenced both erosion and construction logistics. Moving heavy blocks downhill requires less force. Hauling them up demands ramps and teams. The presence of large temple blocks east of the enclosure may reflect this advantage. Engineering choices and symbolic placement overlap, each reinforcing the other. Architectural parallels link the temple near the figure with another associated with a nearby pyramid. Both use huge limestone blocks and granite elements. Both emphasize mass and shadow. Some scholars argue for a unified building program based on these similarities. Others note that reuse of quarry stone could create resemblance even across phases. Stone does not carry timestamps. Context does. Stratigraphic relationships, one wall abutting another, one foundation cutting into earlier fill, help establish sequence. Yet in a heavily modified landscape, such clues can blur. Orientation toward the rising sun holds ritual weight. The east was associated with rebirth, the west with the land of the dead. By facing east, the figure participates in a daily cycle of renewal, greeting the sun as it emerges. Temples often align similarly, creating corridors of light during certain days. Whether planners calculated equinox points precisely or worked from observed sunrise positions, the effect remains. Architecture and sculpture collaborate with celestial motion. Spatial analysis today uses satellite imagery and ground-based scanning to model elevations and lines of sight. These tools confirm earlier surveys and reveal subtle undulations invisible on foot. The monument's placement appears neither random nor isolated. It anchors a cluster of structures that guide movement and vision. Yet integration does not automatically resolve chronology. A later temple can be built to honor an earlier sculpture, just as an earlier quarry void can frame a later shrine. The enclosure's edges show multiple phases of trimming and reinforcement. Some wall faces bear tool marks different from those on the core carving, suggesting adjustments. Masonry platforms beneath the pause extend the natural rock, creating a stage-like apron before the temple. This constructed foreground links bedrock sculpture to block architecture, bridging two building modes. In such a landscape, meaning emerges from relationships. The figure converses with temples, causeways, tombs, and horizons. It is both participant and anchor, shaping how other elements are experienced. Placement here amplifies scale and symbolism, embedding the monument in a choreography of approach and encounter. Spatial evidence establishes integration with a broader design while leaving room for phased development. The stone holds its ground. Around it, architecture arranges itself, aligning, abutting, and adapting, turning terrain into narrative without a single line of text explaining the plan. Consensus in archaeology often forms less like a verdict and more like sediment, layers of interpretation settling over time. Early explorers described the monument with wonder but little analysis, sketching its outline while sand still hugged its sides. As systematic excavation began in the 19th and early 20th centuries, researchers sought to place every major structure within the framework of known royal building programs. Pyramids had names carved inside them. Valley temples yielded statues inscribed with kings' titles. When a colossal bedrock sculpture stood beside such identified complexes, association offered the most economical explanation. Proximity became the first anchor. The monument sits closest to the pyramid and valley temple attributed to a Fourth Dynasty king. Blocks quarried from the enclosure match stone in that temple. stylistic comparison of the head with royal statues from the same complex provided another link. None of these strands alone constitutes proof. Together they formed a net strong enough for working history. Textbooks, site guides, and museum labels adopted the attribution, often without rehearsing the reasoning, because summaries favor clarity over methodological footnotes. Institutional authority amplified this process. Excavation reports by prominent archaeologists carried weight, especially when backed by national antiquities services. Once a major publication framed the monument as part of a specific royal complex, later works cited it as established context. Academic writing depends on shared baselines. Constant re-argument of foundational points would stall progress. As a result, attribution became a background assumption in broader discussions of Old Kingdom state organization, labor systems, and religious symbolism. At the same time, the absence of a dedicatory inscription was acknowledged. Scholars noted the gap, but treated it as an exception rather than a crisis. Egyptian building practice shows variation. Not every project left a surviving text. Erosion, reuse of blocks, and incomplete excavation all contribute to silence. Within this interpretive environment, the weight of architectural and stylistic association outweighed textual absence. Public presentation further solidified the picture. Tour guides, educational documentaries, and signage at the site introduced the monument as a creation of the named king. Tourism favors narrative coherence. Visitors seek stories tied to recognizable figures. Simplification is not deception, but selection. Nuance survives in specialist literature, where footnotes expand and debates persist, but the main storyline remains streamlined. Methodological developments in the late 20th century added new tools without immediately overturning established views. Geological studies highlighted erosion patterns. Conservation science documented material decay. Digital surveys refined measurements. These findings enriched understanding of process and condition. Yet attribution questions often sat at the edge of such studies, which focused on mechanisms rather than authorship. Disciplines tend to stay within their lanes. Geologists describe weathering, art historians compare forms, epigraphers catalog texts, peer review reinforced caution. Proposals challenging consensus must meet high evidentiary standards, especially when they affect widely taught history. Without new inscriptions or datable construction materials, alternatives struggled to achieve the same institutional traction as the established model. Debate continued in conferences and journals, but consensus proved resilient, not because questions vanished, but because shared frameworks facilitate communication. Historiography, the study of how history is written, shows that such processes are common. The first comprehensive synthesis often shapes decades of thought. Later, scholars refine, complicate, or occasionally overturn it, but inertia favors continuity. The monument's attribution illustrates this dynamic. Association, once normalized, becomes infrastructure for further inquiry. None of this implies bad faith. Scholars operate with available evidence and prevailing methods. When evidence is indirect, interpretation remains provisional, even if phrased succinctly. Many academic texts quietly include qualifiers such as generally attributed or associated with, acknowledging degrees of certainty. Public summaries may omit these hedges for readability, creating a gap between specialist caution and popular clarity. Digital access to data in recent years has broadened participation. High-resolution images, 3D models, and open archives allow more researchers to examine surfaces and contexts. This democratization encourages reassessment while also revealing the depth of existing documentation. New perspectives enter the conversation, yet they do so against a backdrop of accumulated scholarship. Consensus, then, is not a closed door, but a working platform. It stabilizes discourse while remaining open to revision. The monument's place within a Fourth Dynasty complex rests on converging lines of association, geographic, material, and stylistic, tempered by recognized gaps in textual evidence. Understanding how that position formed is part of understanding the monument itself, whose modern history includes not only erosion and repair, but also interpretation layered across generations of observers seeking to anchor stone in time. When different kinds of evidence sit side by side, they do not always lock together like puzzle pieces. Sometimes they overlap like transparent sheets, with lines that almost, but not quite, match. Stone records processes, architecture records sequence, and texts record moments considered meaningful enough to inscribe. Each system has its own scale. Geological change unfolds over centuries and millennia. Construction episodes span years or decades. Inscriptions can mark a single day. Aligning these clocks requires care, because forcing one to tick at another's speed distorts both. Erosion on the monument's body displays rounded recesses and vertical channels consistent with water flow, while nearby masonry blocks show sharper edge loss typical of wind-driven sand. This contrast is documented in photographs and site reports. One explanation emphasizes stone quality. Softer layers erode differently from quarried blocks chosen for durability. Another emphasizes exposure history. Surfaces buried under sand for long intervals weather less from wind but remain subject to moisture and salts. Both mechanisms can operate together. The observation itself, difference in surface form, does not specify a date, only a set of processes. Architectural evidence shows that stone from the enclosure entered a nearby temple. This implies that at least part of the pit existed before the temple was completed. Yet a pit can be enlarged over time. Quarrying often proceeds in stages, deepening and widening as needs change. Tool marks on enclosure walls vary in orientation and finish, suggesting multiple episodes. Establishing which cuts belong to the initial shaping and which to later trimming requires close stratigraphic reading. The same principle used in soil layers where one deposit cuts another. Textual silence about the monument's carving during the Old Kingdom stands in tension with the abundance of royal building inscriptions elsewhere. One response points to genre. Many inscriptions celebrate cult foundations and temple endowments, not landscape transformations. Another response notes that absence cannot confirm non-existence. The silence remains a fact, but its meaning is debated. Later texts from the New Kingdom speak of restoration and reverence, framing the figure as ancient already, which sets a lower bound, older than those inscriptions, but not an upper one. Chronological modeling attempts to weave these threads. Climatic studies indicate that northern Africa experienced wetter phases before the dynastic period and continued seasonal rains afterward, decreasing over time. Geological features consistent with runoff could reflect earlier wetter conditions or cumulative effects of sporadic storms. Without datable organic material directly tied to carving, absolute dates remain elusive. Radiocarbon analysis excels with charcoal or wood. Bedrock offers no such samples. Mortars from repairs can be dated, but they speak to restoration, not origin. Proportional analysis of the head introduces another layer. Measurements place it within a broad range of Old Kingdom royal imagery, but do not pinpoint a specific ruler. Art historians accept variation within workshops and materials. Engineering constraints of bedrock carving further complicate comparison. A head carved from a cliff face obeys different rules than one shaped from a freestanding block. These mismatches create zones of uncertainty rather than contradiction. Each line of evidence is internally consistent. Geological processes explain surface forms. Architectural relationships outline sequences. Texts document recognition and care. Difficulty arises when one expects a single narrative thread to run cleanly through all domains. Instead, the record resembles braided strands that touch and separate. Scholarly practice addresses this by marking limits. Papers often include sections noting where evidence does not fully align. Such acknowledgments are not admissions of failure, but statements of scope. They prevent overreach. In complex sites worldwide, from rock-cut temples in India to cliff dwellings in the American Southwest, similar tensions appear between material, environmental, and textual records. Educational summaries tend to compress these nuances, presenting a streamlined chronology for clarity. Specialist literature preserves the friction because friction can guide future research. New techniques, microscopic analysis of weathering crusts, refined stratigraphic mapping, digital modeling of drainage, offer incremental insight. Each may narrow uncertainties without eliminating them. The monument thus stands at an intersection of scales. Its stone carries slow histories of climate and chemistry. Its architecture reflects planning decisions within human lifetimes. Its textual mentions anchor it to specific rulers centuries after carving. None alone dictates the whole timeline. Together they outline a range bounded by physical relationships and historical reference points. Recognizing these points of tension is part of responsible interpretation. It keeps conclusions proportionate to evidence and invites continued measurement. The goal is not to dissolve ambiguity, but to map it, distinguishing what is well supported from what remains open. In this mapped uncertainty, the monument retains both presence and mystery, a fixed mass of rock intersected by lines of inquiry that approach, overlap, and diverge without collapsing into a single, seamless story. Modern investigation begins not with shovels, but with sensors. Before a single grain of sand is moved, teams map the surface in detail, capturing color, texture, and micro-relief. Photogrammetry stitches thousands of photographs into three-dimensional models, allowing researchers to measure from their desks as if standing at the site. Laser scanners add another layer, firing pulses that record distance by timing reflections. The result is a digital skin, a mesh dense enough to show cracks narrower than a fingernail. Such models freeze the monument at a moment in its ongoing change, creating baselines against which future loss can be tracked. Subsurface conditions matter as much as surface form. Ground-penetrating radar sends electromagnetic waves into the rock and reads the echoes. Differences in density and moisture alter signals, revealing fractures, voids, or zones of weakness. These scans do not produce clear photographs underground. they yield patterns that require interpretation, like medical imaging. Reports often stress resolution limits and the influence of salts and water on readings. Even so, the data help engineers plan conservation by identifying areas where stone may delaminate or where repairs have altered stress paths. Material science contributes further. Small samples, taken sparingly, undergo laboratory analysis for porosity, the proportion of empty space within stone, salt content, and mineral composition. Porous limestone absorbs moisture, which carries dissolved salts that crystallize as water evaporates. This crystallization exerts pressure within pores, a process that can be measured experimentally. By understanding these mechanisms, conservators choose repair stones and mortars with compatible properties, avoiding earlier mistakes where cement trapped moisture. Environmental monitoring extends beyond the monument. Sensors track humidity, temperature swings, and airborne pollutants. Urban growth near the plateau introduces new variables: vehicle emissions, irrigation runoff, and altered dust composition. Data show daily and seasonal cycles that differ from ancient conditions. Conservation plans must address present threats while respecting historical fabric, a balance between intervention and restraint. Digital models also support historical analysis. By comparing scans from different years, researchers quantify volume loss, identifying hotspots of decay. Color-coded maps visualize recession depths, turning subtle changes into readable patterns. These tools do not date carving, but they refine understanding of how the monument responds to environment. Such knowledge feeds back into hypotheses about past weathering, grounding speculation in observed behavior. Archival reassessment parallels fieldwork. Early photographs, drawings, and excavation notes are digitized and georeferenced, aligning old views with current coordinates. This process reveals how surfaces looked before certain repairs or exposures. Differences between images highlight the impact of 20th century conservation choices. The monument becomes a case study in the history of preservation itself, where methods evolve alongside materials. Interdisciplinary collaboration defines this phase. Geologists, engineers, archaeologists, and conservators meet to interpret findings. Each discipline brings its vocabulary: bedding planes, stress tensors, stratigraphy, iconography. Joint reports often include sections explicitly listing uncertainties and data gaps. This transparency reflects a shift from grand narratives to incremental knowledge, where each study narrows questions without claiming finality. Technology also democratizes access. Online repositories share 3D models and high-resolution images, allowing scholars worldwide to examine details once limited to on-site specialists. This openness invites fresh perspectives and cross-comparisons with other rock-cut monuments. Patterns observed here can be tested against data from distant sites, refining criteria for distinguishing erosion types or carving techniques. Public communication adapts as well. Interactive visualizations help visitors understand invisible processes, how salts migrate, how temperature gradients stress stone. Education moves from static labels to dynamic explanation, showing the monument as a system in motion. Yet public narratives still balance clarity with complexity, translating technical findings into accessible language. Despite technological advances, certain limits remain. Absolute dating of exposed limestone surfaces is still challenging. Methods like cosmogenic nuclide analysis, which measures isotopes formed by cosmic rays, are being explored but require careful calibration. Until such techniques mature, relative sequencing and association remain central. Technology sharpens resolution without dissolving fundamental constraints. What modern reassessment offers is not a new origin story, but a clearer picture of condition, process, and change. The monument emerges as a dynamic interface between stone and environment, human intention, and natural force. Digital tools extend the senses, allowing researchers to see patterns across scales, from microscopic pores to site-wide topography. In this layered data, the past is approached through present behavior, linking centuries of observation into a continuum of care. Across long spans of time, the monument has functioned less as a fixed object and more as a participant in cycles of attention and neglect. Its visibility has risen and fallen with political stability, religious priorities, and simple logistics. When centralized authority thrived, labor could be organized to clear sand, repair stone, and integrate the figure into active ritual landscapes. When that authority fractured, maintenance slowed, and the desert resumed its quiet work. These rhythms leave traces not only in masonry, but in how the monument was understood. By the New Kingdom, the figure had already become an ancient presence. Inscriptions from that era speak of restoration and reverence, not recent creation. The act of clearing sand appears as piety, a king proving worth by honoring what predecessors left. This pattern reflects a broader Egyptian relationship with the past. Earlier monuments were not seen as relics, but as sources of power. Restoring them renewed cosmic order, a concept called ma'at, which meant balance between human action and universal harmony. The monument thus served as a bridge across dynasties, a focus for continuity. Later periods show different engagements. During times of foreign rule, Assyrian, Persian, Greek, Roman, attention shifted according to new administrative centers and religious frameworks. Graffiti from these eras attest to visits, prayers, and personal marks. Travelers carved names much as modern visitors leave signatures, signaling presence before immensity. Repairs continued intermittently, often practical rather than ceremonial, stabilizing vulnerable stone without recreating ideal form. Medieval Islamic writers encountered a partially buried head rising from dunes. They recorded local legends, sometimes attributing damage to iconoclasm or moral tales. These accounts blend observation with storytelling, reflecting how monumental scale invites narrative. The Arabic name Abu al-Hol, Father of Dread, emphasizes emotional impact. Here the monument enters folklore, detached from dynastic lists, yet anchored in landscape memory. European travelers of the early modern period approached with antiquarian curiosity. Sketches and descriptions show the head above sand, proportions distorted by limited exposure. Excavation in the 19th century shifted perception again. As sand was removed, the body reappeared, transforming a mysterious head into a full figure. Photographs from this era document surfaces before modern conservation, providing a baseline for later comparison. 20th century archaeology framed the monument within systematic history. Excavators cleared the enclosure, documented repairs, and integrated findings into broader narratives of Old Kingdom state power. At the same time, conservation emerged as a discipline, responding to accelerated decay after full exposure. The monument became both research subject and patient, its survival requiring ongoing intervention. These cycles illustrate how meaning and condition intertwine. Burial preserved some surfaces while erasing others from view. Exposure invited study, but increased stress. Each phase altered not only stone, but interpretation. A half-buried head suggests enigma. A fully revealed body emphasizes engineering. Religious texts highlight divinity. Geological reports highlight process. The monument's identity shifts with context. Memory practices play a role. Cultures remember through reuse, restoration, and storytelling. By reinscribing older monuments, later rulers inserted themselves into a lineage. By clearing sand, they enacted renewal. Such acts create historical layers as tangible as masonry. Modern conservation, though secular, continues this tradition of care, motivated by heritage rather than theology. Environmental change underlies these human rhythms. Shifts in Nile channels, agricultural expansion, and urban growth modify moisture and dust patterns. Ancient builders did not anticipate modern pollution. Modern conservators manage threats unknown to their predecessors. The monument thus embodies not only ancient history, but contemporary responsibility. Documentation now captures these layers. Archives hold excavation diaries, conservation reports, and digital scans, forming a parallel monument in paper and data. Scholars trace how interpretations evolved, mapping intellectual history alongside physical change. This reflexive awareness, studying how we study, adds another dimension to the monument's story. Through all phases, the figure remains a focal point, drawing attention even when half hidden. Its scale anchors it in memory. Its ambiguity invites reinterpretation. Each generation approaches with its own questions, shaped by available tools and cultural frameworks. The result is not a single narrative, but a palimpsest of engagements, where ancient reverence, medieval legend, colonial archaeology, and modern science overlap. Understanding these cycles clarifies that the monument's history extends beyond its carving. It includes centuries of interaction, neglect, repair, and reinterpretation. Stone endures, but its meaning is renewed repeatedly. The figure stands at the intersection of material persistence and cultural change, a witness to shifting worlds that have, in turn, shaped how it is seen, studied, and sustained. The monument's material story does not end at the surface. It extends into the invisible exchanges between stone, air, and water. Limestone appears solid, yet under magnification it resembles a sponge, riddled with microscopic pores left by ancient marine organisms and sediment gaps. These pores govern how moisture moves. When humidity rises, water vapor condenses inside. When air dries, it migrates outward. Dissolved salts travel with this movement, crystallizing as conditions shift. Each crystal growth exerts pressure, prying grains apart from within, a slow force that leaves surfaces powdery or flaked. Different limestone layers respond differently. Dense strata resist penetration, while softer beds absorb and release moisture readily. The monument's body includes both, creating a patchwork of vulnerabilities. Where ancient repairs introduced stones with slightly different porosity, boundaries form where moisture accumulates. These interfaces act like seams in fabric, concentrating stress. Modern conservation maps such zones, treating the monument as a composite rather than a single block. Color variations across the surface tell part of this story. Darker patches often indicate moisture retention or biological growth, such as algae or lichens. Though the desert seems inhospitable, Microenvironments in shaded recesses can support life. Organisms excrete acids that etch stone, adding biological weathering to chemical and mechanical processes. Cleaning must be gentle because removing growth without addressing moisture sources leads to rapid return. Airborne particles also play a role. Dust carries minerals that lodge in pores, sometimes sealing them, sometimes providing nuclei for salt formation. Modern pollutants introduce sulfur and nitrogen compounds that can react with limestone to form gypsum, a softer mineral. Such reactions alter surface chemistry, making stone more friable. Monitoring stations track pollutant levels, linking urban development to conservation strategies. Temperature fluctuations add mechanical strain. Limestone expands when heated and contracts when cooled. Daily cycles create micro-movements, especially along bedding planes where different layers respond at slightly different rates. Over time, these movements widen cracks. Thermal stress is moderated by burial under sand, which insulates against extremes. Full exposure increases amplitude, a trade-off between visibility and preservation. Conservation responses draw on this understanding. Replacement stones are selected for similar porosity and mineral composition to avoid mismatched behavior. Mortars are formulated to be weaker than the original stone, allowing them to fail first and protect the substrate, a principle called sacrificial repair. Drainage improvements redirect water away from vulnerable areas, reducing salt transport. Such interventions aim not to freeze the monument, but to slow deterioration. Documentation accompanies each step. Samples are logged with coordinates, test results archived. Over years, this creates a database of material properties, enabling predictive models. Engineers simulate moisture flow or stress distribution, identifying zones at risk. These models borrow from civil engineering and geology, disciplines concerned with rock stability in tunnels and cliffs. The monument becomes a case study in applied stone science. Public understanding often lags behind this complexity. Visitors see cracks and patches without perceiving the microphysics at work. Educational materials now attempt to bridge this gap, explaining porosity with sponge analogies and salt crystallization with simple experiments. Such outreach fosters appreciation for conservation as science rather than cosmetic repair. Research into protective treatments continues. Consolidants, liquids that penetrate stone and strengthen it, are tested for compatibility and reversibility. Reversibility matters because future techniques may improve on present ones. Interventions that cannot be undone risk locking the monument into outdated solutions. Conservation ethics emphasize minimal intervention, respect for original material, and thorough recording. Despite best efforts, some change is inevitable. Stone exposed to environment will weather. The goal shifts from permanence to stewardship, managing rate rather than halting process. This perspective aligns with broader environmental awareness. Monuments exist within ecosystems, not outside them. The material narrative thus frames the monument as dynamic matter. Its endurance depends on balancing natural processes with informed care. Microscopic pores and crystals, invisible to casual observers, influence macroscopic appearance. Understanding this hidden activity enriches interpretation of visible forms. The monument stands not only as art or architecture, but as a laboratory of stone behavior, where ancient carving meets modern science in the shared task of prolonging the life of a mass that has already endured millennia of exchange with the elements. Ritual gives architecture a pulse. Without movement, sound, and gesture, stone remains structure. With them, it becomes a stage for belief. The monument's position near processional routes suggests it once participated in ceremonies that linked river, temple, and tomb. Boats arriving on the Nile would unload offerings and statues, which priests carried along paved ways toward mortuary complexes. Passing the figure, participants crossed from the fertile floodplain, associated with daily life, into the desert plateau, associated with eternity. This transition embodied the journey from temporal existence to the afterlife. Egyptian religious thought centered on cycles: the sun's daily path, the Nile's annual flood, and the king's role in renewing cosmic order all mirrored each other. The east, where the sun rises, symbolized rebirth. The west, where it sets, symbolized death and transformation. By facing east, the monument aligned with this cycle, greeting dawn as a perpetual witness. Such orientation embedded theology in topography. The horizon, called al-Akhet, was imagined as a gateway through which the sun god traveled. The monument's later name, linking it to Horus of the horizon, reflects this imagery. Guardian figures flanked sacred thresholds throughout Egypt. Lions, associated with solar power and protection, often stood at temple entrances. Combining lion body with human head fused strength and intelligence, qualities attributed to kingship. In this hybrid form, the monument could serve as both royal symbol and divine manifestation. The duality mirrors Egyptian cosmology, where gods and kings share attributes without collapsing into sameness. Ceremonial space extended beyond built walls. Open courtyards, causeways, and even natural rock faces participated in ritual choreography. Processions created temporary sacred paths, activated by movement rather than permanent markers. The monument's enclosure may have functioned as such a space during certain rites, with the temple to the east providing a more formal setting. Light-entering courts at specific times could highlight statues or altars, turning architecture into a solar instrument. Texts from later periods describe rituals of renewal, where kings restored older monuments to assert legitimacy. Clearing sand from the figure would have been both practical and symbolic, removing chaos, represented by desert encroachment, and re-establishing order. The act echoes myths in which gods defeat disorder to sustain creation. Restoration thus becomes performance, inscribed not only on stone, but in collective memory. Offerings likely accompanied such acts. Food, incense, and libations placed before the monument acknowledged it as a living presence. Egyptian theology allowed statues to house divine essence through rituals that opened the mouth and eyes, enabling them to receive sustenance. Whether the monument underwent such rites originally or acquired them later, its scale and form invited this mode of engagement. Sound also shaped experience. Hymns recited in open courts carried differently than within enclosed chambers. Drums, sistrums, rattles associated with the goddess Hathor, and chants created acoustic landscapes. The enclosure's walls could reflect and focus sound, enhancing atmosphere. Though no recordings survive, architectural acoustics studies suggest that large stone surfaces amplify low frequencies, producing resonance felt as much as heard. Festivals provided peak moments. During certain annual events, cult statues traveled between temples, reenacting mythic journeys. The monument's location along routes connecting valley and plateau positioned it within this network. Even if not the primary focus, it formed part of the ritual scenery, like a landmark in a sacred procession. Over time, ritual roles shift. As political centers moved and religious emphasis changed, ceremonies at the plateau likely diminished. Yet memory of earlier rites lingered, sustaining reverence. Later inscriptions reflect this continuity, presenting the monument as ancient and divine. The layering of function mirrors the layering of stone repairs, new meanings built upon old foundations. Modern visitors, though not participating in ancient rites, still enact a form of pilgrimage. Approaching along designated paths, pausing to photograph or contemplate, they reproduce patterns of movement and attention. Interpretation panels replace hymns, cameras replace offerings. The impulse to mark presence before monumental stone persists. Understanding ritual context broadens interpretation beyond engineering and chronology. It situates the monument within lived religion, where architecture mediates between human and cosmic realms. Stone here is not inert mass, but a partner in cycles of renewal, a fixed point around which movement and meaning revolved. Through processions, prayers, and restorations, the monument's role evolved, yet its capacity to anchor ritual space endured, binding physical placement to spiritual landscape across centuries of changing belief. Interpretation often drifts toward dramatic conclusions, yet the monument resists simple origin stories. Its scale tempts narratives of lost civilizations or forgotten technologies, but close examination anchors it in observable processes. Tools leave marks, quarries leave scars, and logistics leave patterns of supply and labor. Extraordinary claims require evidence beyond association or anomaly. In studying this monument, scholars balance openness to new data with adherence to methodological rigor, a discipline shaped by centuries of archaeological practice. Comparative analysis forms one pillar. Rock-cut monuments elsewhere in Egypt and beyond provide reference points. Temples at Abu Simbel, for example, were carved into sandstone cliffs, adapting design to geology. Their facades integrate sculpture with bedrock, similar in principle, though different in style. Such parallels show that large-scale bedrock carving lies within known ancient capabilities. Variation in proportion or detail reflects local stone properties and cultural conventions rather than technological mystery. Experimental archaeology offers another approach. Recreating ancient tools and techniques demonstrates what is physically possible. Copper chisels hardened with arsenic can cut limestone effectively when paired with stone pounders for roughing. Sledges on lubricated tracks move heavy blocks without wheels. These experiments do not replicate every ancient condition, but they ground feasibility in practice. When a method works in controlled tests, it strengthens the case that ancient builders could achieve similar results. Stratigraphic observation anchors chronology. Where one structure abuts another, sequence can be inferred. If temple walls incorporate blocks quarried from the enclosure, quarrying predates construction. If repairs overlay eroded surfaces, erosion predates repair. Such relationships build relative timelines independent of written dates. Absolute dating remains difficult, yet relative sequencing narrows possibilities. Critically, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but neither does it prove alternative scenarios. When inscriptions are missing, explanations must rest on material and contextual data. Proposals that push origins far earlier than established chronologies must account for continuity in material culture, tool types, and settlement patterns. Archaeology favors convergence of independent lines of evidence, textual, material, environmental, before revising frameworks. Historians also examine how modern perspectives shape interpretation. Colonial-era archaeology often prioritized monumental architecture over everyday life, influencing which questions were asked. Contemporary scholarship expands focus to labor organization, environmental context, and conservation science. Recognizing these shifts helps avoid projecting present assumptions backward. Media representations can amplify fringe theories drawn to mystery and spectacle. Scholars respond by emphasizing transparency, publishing data, explaining methods, and distinguishing hypothesis from fact. Public engagement becomes part of scholarly responsibility, countering misinformation without dismissing curiosity. Technological advances continue to refine understanding. High-resolution imaging reveals tool traces invisible before. Geochemical analysis traces stone sources with precision. Climate modeling reconstructs past rainfall patterns. Each development adds nuance, sometimes supporting established views, sometimes complicating them. Progress rarely overturns everything at once. It accumulates detail. The monument's endurance across millennia underscores the value of patient study. Quick answers may satisfy narratives, but risk overlooking complexity. The interplay of geology, construction, ritual, and conservation creates a web of factors that defies single-cause explanations. Responsible interpretation navigates this web carefully, acknowledging limits. Ultimately, the monument story illustrates archaeology's broader challenge, reconstructing human intention from material traces shaped by natural forces. Certainty is graded, not absolute. Some aspects, scale, placement, material, are well documented. Others, exact sequence of carving phases, full ritual history, remain open. This openness is not failure, but invitation, guiding future inquiry. By grounding discussion in evidence and method, scholarship maintains credibility. The monument stands as both subject and teacher, reminding observers that stone can outlast stories and that careful attention to what is physically present offers the most reliable path through speculation. In this balance between curiosity and constraint lies the discipline's strength, ensuring that wonder does not eclipse reason, and that the monument's enduring presence continues to inform rather than merely astonish. Standing before the monument today means encountering not a frozen relic, but the current state of a long negotiation between stone, climate, and human care. Conservation teams treat it as a living system whose stability depends on constant observation. Cracks are mapped like medical scans, salts measured like blood chemistry, and surfaces photographed at intervals to catch subtle change. This vigilance reflects an understanding that preservation is not a one-time achievement, but an ongoing process. One challenge lies in balancing access with protection. Visitors bring moisture on breath and clothing, vibrations from footsteps, and airborne particles stirred by movement. Pathways and barriers guide flow to reduce stress on vulnerable zones. Viewing platforms lift foot traffic above sensitive ground, echoing ancient practices of controlling approach through causeways and courts. Managing crowds becomes part of conservation strategy. Water management remains central. Irrigation in surrounding areas can raise groundwater levels, increasing capillary moisture in limestone. Engineers install drainage systems and monitor wells to track fluctuations. Redirecting runoff from rare but intense storms prevents pooling in the enclosure. Such measures show how modern land use intersects with ancient stone, linking heritage management to regional planning. Material compatibility guides repairs. Earlier use of cement, stronger than limestone, created rigid patches that trapped moisture and accelerated decay nearby. Current practice favors lime-based mortars and stones with similar porosity, allowing the structure to breathe. Repairs are documented meticulously, so future conservators can distinguish original fabric from later additions. Transparency ensures that intervention history remains readable. Education forms another layer of protection. Informational displays explain why certain areas are restricted and why surfaces appear patched. When visitors understand the reasons, compliance improves. Outreach programs train local guides and workers, building community investment in preservation. The monument's survival depends not only on specialists, but on collective stewardship. Climate change introduces new variables. Shifts in rainfall patterns, temperature extremes, and pollution levels can alter weathering rates. Long-term monitoring allows adaptation of strategies. Conservation planning thus extends beyond immediate repairs to predictive modeling, anticipating how conditions may evolve over decades. Documentation now creates a parallel archive. High-resolution scans, environmental data, and repair logs form a digital twin of the monument. This virtual model aids research and provides insurance against unforeseen loss. If surfaces deteriorate, earlier states remain recorded, supporting restoration decisions and scholarly study. Ethical considerations guide action. The goal is to preserve authenticity, the original material and historical layers, while ensuring structural safety. Over-restoration risks falsifying history. Under-intervention risks collapse. Finding the middle path requires judgment informed by science and respect for cultural significance. International collaboration strengthens capacity. Conservation experts from different countries share techniques and case studies from other stone monuments, such as cliff temples or medieval cathedrals. Cross-site comparison enriches understanding of common challenges like salt damage or thermal stress. The monument also functions as a symbol in contemporary identity and tourism. Its image circulates globally, shaping perceptions of heritage. Revenue from tourism supports conservation, but increases wear. Managing this balance requires policy as much as science. Looking ahead, research continues into less invasive treatments, improved sensors, and refined dating methods. Each advance aims to extend the monument's lifespan without erasing its history. Preservation becomes a dialogue across generations, each inheriting both stone and responsibility. In this ongoing effort, the monument serves as a reminder that cultural heritage exists within ecological and social systems. Its endurance depends on understanding those systems and acting with foresight. The ancient carvers shaped limestone. Modern stewards shape conditions that allow that shaping to endure. Through monitoring, maintenance, and education, the negotiation continues, ensuring that the monument remains a presence in the landscape, not merely a memory recorded in archives. Stone endures not because it is unchanging, but because its changes are slow enough to be witnessed across generations. The monument's presence on the plateau compresses deep time and human time into one field of vision. Beneath its surface lie marine sediments laid down when this land sat under an ancient sea. Above that geology lie tool strokes, repairs, and the microscopic tracks of water and salt. Around it unfold cycles of belief, abandonment, rediscovery, and study. The figure stands where these timelines intersect, a fixed coordinate through which different eras pass. No single layer tells the whole story. Geological processes explain how surfaces soften, fissures widen, and profiles round. Architectural relationships show how stone removed became stone built, linking voids to temples. Texts record reverence and restoration, capturing moments when the monument entered written consciousness. Modern science measures change in millimeters and parts per million. Each perspective illuminates part of the structure while leaving other parts in shadow. This multiplicity is not a weakness, but a characteristic of long-lived monuments. A tree hundreds of years old contains rings from different climates. A city built over centuries shows streets from different plans. The monument is similar, a composite of phases rather than a single event frozen in time. Expecting a single, clean narrative is like expecting a river to flow in a straight line. Instead, evidence bends, overlaps, and loops back. Human intention is visible in the initial shaping, in the decision to leave mass here and remove it there, to orient the face toward sunrise, to integrate sculpture with terrain. Yet intention does not control what follows. Climate shifts, sand drifts, water seeps, and later hands intervene. The monument becomes a collaboration between creators and environment, a partnership spanning millennia. Its scale ensures visibility, but scale alone does not guarantee survival. Many large structures have vanished through quarrying, reuse, or collapse. Survival here depended partly on burial, partly on reverence, partly on chance. Sand that obscured also protected. Later generations who cleared and repaired extended its life. Modern conservation continues that chain, informed by knowledge unavailable in earlier periods. Interpretation evolves with tools and questions. Early visitors saw wonder. Antiquarians saw antiquity. Archaeologists saw context. Conservators see material processes. Digital analysts see data clouds. None of these views cancels the others. Together they form a layered understanding mirroring the monument's own layers. Knowledge accumulates, even as uncertainty remains. Uncertainty itself has value. It marks the boundary between what stone can tell directly and what must be inferred. By mapping that boundary, scholarship maintains honesty. The monument invites inquiry without yielding all answers, sustaining engagement across disciplines. Geologists, historians, engineers, and artists all find material here for reflection. Culturally, the figure has become emblematic, representing ancient achievement in global imagination. Its image circulates beyond the plateau, detached from specific context yet anchored in memory. This symbolic life adds another dimension, where the monument functions in modern identity and heritage politics. Stone becomes sign, carrying meanings far from its original setting. Yet physical presence remains central. Standing at its base, one feels scale not as number but as bodily relation. The head rises beyond easy gaze. The paws stretch longer than a room. Such embodied experience connects present observers with past builders, separated by time, yet sharing the same sensory encounter with mass and space. The monument's future depends on continued care and adaptive understanding. As environments and societies change, strategies must adjust. What endures is not static preservation, but dynamic stewardship, guided by evidence and respect. Each generation adds a chapter of maintenance, interpretation, and meaning. In the end, the monument exemplifies how human works entered geological time. Carved from bedrock, it is both artifact and landscape. Its story unfolds horizontally across domains, material, environmental, cultural, rather than vertically through a single narrative thread. To approach it is to navigate these layers, recognizing that certainty has limits, but presence does not. The stone remains, weathered yet standing, a convergence point where Earth history and human history meet and continue together.